Today's lesson is lesson 79, found on page 517, factoring trinomials by using the greatest common factor. We're going to start with the problem 5a to the fifth power plus 3a to the fourth power minus 18a to the third power. What we do is we look for their greatest common factor. In this example, the greatest common factor is a to the third power. Remember, the greatest common factor is what all three terms have in common. So we factor out the the a to the third power, and in parentheses we put what's left after we factored it. The first term, there's two a's that are left after I factor out 5, so a to the second power is written. For my second term, what's left is 3a, and the third term, after the a cubed is factored out, what's left is 18. What you are then expected to do with the a squared plus 3a minus 18 is factor it like we did in the previous lessons. We will not be reviewing that concept today. The next example is 2m to the fourth power minus 16m to the third power plus 30m squared. In this example, the greatest common factor is 2m squared. So I put the 2m squared in the front of the parentheses. What happens is we divide all three terms by their greatest common factor, which is that 2m squared. In the parentheses again, we write what's left over. After I divide the 2 from the 2m, the 2 cancels and it goes away. And I subtract these exponents, remembering that rule, to get m to the second power left. Here I have negative 16 divided by 2, which is then negative 8. And then I have m3 and m2, which then simplifies to m to the first power, remembering that we subtract these exponents. 30 divided by 2 gets 15. And then when I subtract 2 minus 2, I get 0, which means the m totally drops off. We would then set to work on factoring m squared minus 8m plus 15. Like previously, we would make our x. We put the 15 at the top and the negative 8 at the bottom. And we would go to work to factor. When we're all done, it should look like this, 2m to the second power, and then in the parentheses, after we factored it, we'd write that there, which would be an m here and an m here, and then we have a 5 and a 3 that multiply to get 15, but they both have to be negative in order for them to add to get a negative 8. So this would be the new factored expression. The next example starts us off with a coefficient which is negative. The leading coefficient should always be positive. The leading coefficient is the coefficient that sits with the variable that has the biggest exponent. Since this exponent is 3, this is my leading coefficient. So in looking at this trinomial, I have 3 d's here, 2 d's here, and 1 d here. So their greatest common factor is d. So while I'm factoring out that d, I'm also going to get rid of that negative and factor out the negative as well. When I do that, I have d squared plus 7d plus 6. The reason why these two things have turned to positive because I factored out their negative. The negative is here. Remember, if you distribute, which means you multiply, if I take negative d and multiply it times d to the second power, I'll get negative d to the third power. If I take negative d and multiply it times positive 7d, I'll get negative d to the negative 7d to the second power. And if I took a negative d and I multiplied it times 6, then I would get a negative 6d. That's always a good way to check to see if you've factored correctly. If you factor correctly, If you distribute, you should always end up with the same thing that you started with. The last example that we're going to go over is when the terms are out of order. We just spoke about the leading coefficient and how the leading coefficient is the number that has the biggest exponent. Well, as we glance really fast, we see that a 3 is here next to the a. This negative 10b a to the third power is my leading coefficient. So the first thing that I would do in this example is to rearrange the terms so that the leading coefficient is first. So I put negative 10b a to the third first, then comes the a to the squared term next, and last comes the a term that's by itself. Now I'm ready to factor out the greatest common factor. The greatest common factor is negative 5ba, because that's the thing that they all have. What's left is 2a squared plus 7a minus 4. The biggest mistake that people make is sign errors. You have to make sure when you factored out a negative number that you flip the sign of the things that are left. So this negative is now written a positive, and this positive is now a negative. So please be careful of those things.